Several years ago, 7 I think to be exact, if I remember right, I asked several people that I know here at Riverwalk to let me know what their favorite psalm, P-S-A-L-M, psalm, not song, but psalm, was if they had one. Might be interesting to ask what your favorite song is too, so I may do that too. I did a class on those. I'll just back up. I may do a favorite song thing. It would be nice to know what Linda Hooten's favorite song is, or Jana Lee's, or I'm just hopeful that it's not Inagata Davida by the Iron Butterfly. How many of you remember that? Yeah. I did a class on those psalms. There were several people that responded. And I did a class on those psalms 5 years or so ago. I highlighted Psalm 1 and 2, Psalm 119, 139, 19, some of these may be your favorite psalms, 145, 51, 39, 90, 121, and of course Psalm 23. You may have been in that class in the winter of 2017, I don't know. But it's been long enough ago that you probably won't remember because I'm taking notes out of that class. So. But I'd like to take a portion of that class, and I'd like to look at just one of those psalms. Thought it might be prudent here to give you a break. Curtis has been doing some really in-depth stuff these past several weeks, and well worth attending class for. But let's just take a break and let's talk about not something fluffy, but let's talk about something a little bit different. I hope you will continue to go to Curtis's class. We both thought, as did the elders, that class was very important and was deserving of everyone's attention that comes to Bible class. But I want to first start out with some general information about the Psalms. You probably know most of this. The Psalms are written in the Hebrew in poetic form. Many of those were songs, S-O-N-G-S, that were sung by the ancient people of God. However, the book of Psalms is not the only place in the Old Testament where we find songs or poems that are recorded. I'm wondering if maybe you, in way of class participation, can think of, off the top of your head, any places in Scripture other than the Psalms where there are poems or there are songs that are put into the Scriptures. Anybody have any? Solomon what? The Song of Solomon? Okay. A lot of the Song of Solomon is in poetic form or song form.
Song of Moses?
The Song of Moses. That one is, actually Moses did 2 or 3. There's one that we call the Song of Moses. Yeah.
Mary did a song after she knew she was to be the mother.
She did. Mary did a song. He either composed it or used a poem or a song that was already in existence or borrowed from one and did her own song. What else?
Miriam,
Miriam had a song. Who was Miriam?
Moses' sister.
Miriam was Moses' sister. Do you remember kind of what that was all about? Anybody remember what that was all about?
Crossing the Red Sea.
Say again.
Was it after crossing the Red Sea?
Yeah, it was. It was. What I have here, I've got Miriam's song listed here as one of them. Moses and Israel sang a song to the Lord when they were delivered from the Egyptians through the Red Sea, Exodus chapter 15. And then Miriam answered that song with a short verse of her own. She repeated the first part of that song in verse 21 of that same chapter. Oh, that same song, by the way, was also sung at the founding of the nation of Israel by covenant with God, and it continues to be used this day in synagogues in worship. Anyone else?
I've read that the passage in Philippians, 2nd chapter, about Jesus not grasping his place in heaven may have been an early Christian hymn. I don't know that it's...
Right. I've heard that also, Shelley, and I think it probably has a lot going for it in terms of thinking of it as such. We don't look at that passage as being in song or poetic form, but we're not looking at it in the original language either. Yeah, there's several. There's quite a few. As I said, Moses had more than one poem or song. What about, actually, the book that I'm using, or used on this, even talked about the oracles of Balaam. You remember him, the prophet? There were several of those that were written in poetic form in the Hebrew. The Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, that was mentioned. There's a blessing of Moses in Deuteronomy 33. The Song of Deborah, if you remember Deborah in Judges. When she was victorious in battle, there was a song that she sang, and I'm assuming she composed, and that's recorded for us. There's the song of, go ahead. I was just going to mention that. There's the song of Hannah in the book of 1 Samuel. There are quite a few, actually, in terms of either songs or poems put to song. So that's just some of the many. The Psalms were compiled from the pens of several different authors. An obvious author of some of the Psalms was King David, who would be one or two or three more. Moses would be another one.
Of the actual Psalms,
The actual
there
Psalms.
was somebody called Asaph.
Somebody called Asaph or Asaph.
Sons of Korah.
The sons of Korah. I've got 1, 2, 3 more listed, and I get to cheat because I get the look. There are 3 more that I have here. A guy by the name of Heman the Ezrahite, and then there's an Ethan the Ezrahite, and then Solomon is said to have written one or more of the Psalms. So there were several authors, but several of the Psalms don't divulge the author, and several of the Psalms we don't have any idea who the author was. And many of the Psalms, 116 of the 150 Psalms, have a title attached to them. Were you aware of that? 116 of the 150 Psalms have a title. If you look, for example, at Psalm 38, Psalm 40, Psalm 42, those are just 3 of them. Turn to that page. Psalm 38, it says, a Psalm of David for a memorial. Psalm 40, for the choir director, a Psalm of David. Psalm 42, for the choir director, a maskil of the sons of Korah. Those titles are part of the Hebrew canon. They weren't added later on by translators or anybody like that. They were part of the Hebrew canon, and they need to be treated as part of the original Hebrew writings. They weren't added on later. And they do have meaning for that particular psalm. I don't know why all of them don't. I don't know that. I just know that they tell me that there's 116. I didn't count 116 of them that do have that kind of a title. Well, with that, let's just take a look at Psalm 119, the longest psalm in the Bible, the longest chapter in the Bible. This is the psalm when I asked several years ago for someone's favorite psalm. This was Matt Reese's favorite psalm. Matt is not here to defend himself, so I can kind of, oh, there he is here to defend himself. This is what Matt said some years ago about Psalm 119. And I told him earlier that I was going to do this today, so he's well aware of it. This is Matt. I'm quoting Matt. I'm not sure it's a favorite, but one that is coming to mean a lot to me as I work to memorize it this year. Do I dare ask him if he succeeded?
I did not. Made it through about 100 verses.
Well, that's better than I did, so. I read Amazing Grace about the life of William Wilberforce. He had Psalm 119 memorized, and he would recite it as he walked from place to place. And Matt goes on. He says, it struck me that I could do that and recite it as I ride around town. He's got a bicycle and he rides around town. So that's what I'm working on this year and probably into next and probably for the next 5 or 6 years. The overall idea of love for and delighting in God's commands for us is one that is slowly changing me. Memorizing has made me think about what it really means more than I ever have just reading through. And then Matt goes on to mention some favorite verses in this psalm that we'll get to a little bit later in the lesson. So, Psalm 119, the longest chapter, longest psalm. This psalm is what, and you probably know this already because I'm sure you've been told this. This psalm is an acrostic, and I'm not a poet. I hated poetry. I had a 7th grade English teacher that, well, I would say she shoved poetry down my throat, but that's okay. It did me good to learn about the village smithy and the road less traveled and some of those. Oh well, we'll go on. This psalm is an acrostic. That is, each of the 22 stanzas of the psalm are related to one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Each verse in each stanza begins with the corresponding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, we don't see that in the English rendering, but it is there in the Hebrew. And like the first 8 verses, the first Hebrew letter is Aleph, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any means. So each of the verses in that stanza begins with a word that begins with the Aleph letter in Hebrew. So one thing, second eight verses, the Hebrew letter Beth, and then so on down through all 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There is a portion of this psalm, Psalm 119, 41 through 48, that stanza. Those lines are using the letter Vav, V-A-V, or some call it Waw, W-A-W. There are very few words in the Hebrew language that begin with that letter, kind of like X in our language. There are not that many words that begin with X that you can use as the first word in a poem. There are only 3 words, as a matter of fact, in the entire Hebrew language that begin with that letter. But that letter also can be a complete word. That word in the Hebrew is our conjunction and. So the psalmist begins every line in those verses, 41 through 48, with the word and. And you can see evidence of that. You can't see it in all the translations, but you can see evidence of that in several of the translations, which usually are not word for word. They're thought-based, but my translation, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of those 8 verses start with the letter and. I'm going to read Young's literal translation, and you'll be able to see how that works. Here's Young's literal. And the language is very stilted because this is a literal translation. And to meet me doth thy kindness, O Jehovah, thy salvation according to thy saying. And I answer him who is reproaching me a word, for I have trusted in thy word. And thou takest not utterly away from my mouth the word of truth, because for thy judgment I have hoped. And I keep thy law continually to the age and forever. And I walk habitually in a broad place, for thy precepts I have sought. And I speak of thy testimonies before kings, and I am not ashamed. And I delight myself in thy commands that I have loved. And I lift up my hands unto thy commands that I have loved, and I do meditate on thy statutes. So that's Young's literal of the Hebrew of Psalm 119, 41 to 48. As you might imagine, this psalm is really a work of art. I mean, to take the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, compose a poem with 8 verses in each stanza, and there are 22 stanzas, and get the point across that the poet wants to get across in terms of God's commands and obedience to God's commands. We don't know for certainty who composed this psalm. They did a lot of work to make the letters come out as they did, and it was a vehicle for what he was trying to say. Well, Matt goes on to give some of his favorite passages out of Psalm 119. And here are some of his favorites. Psalm 119 and verse 5 in a New Living. Oh, that my actions would consistently reflect your principles. Verses 32 and verse 45. I shall run the way of your commandments, for you will enlarge my heart. And then verse 45. And I will walk at liberty, for I seek your precepts. And then Matt puts in there, this is Matt again, his law is not a prison, but a place where we can run in freedom. I like that. Verses 36 and 37. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to dishonest gain. Turn away my eyes from looking at vanity and revive me in your ways. And Matt says about that, he says this is a prayer that could keep a lot of us out of a lot of trouble. I'm going to read that one again. I need that one. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to dishonest gain. Turn away my eyes from looking at vanity. Revive me in your ways. And then one more, verse 74. Your hands made me and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments. And then Matt's comment on that. God's people should rejoice when they see me, a pretty lofty goal. God's people should rejoice when they see me, a pretty lofty goal. And then Matt says, I could probably keep going, but that's enough for now. There are several other well-known passages out of Psalm 119, and I've got several here. But have you read Psalm 119 recently? Do you have any favorite verses or passages out of this psalm that you might want to share with us? And I know that you probably haven't read this for a while. I understand that. I get that. You haven't had time to think about it. I get that. Well, while I'm I'll just leave that question with you for a minute, and I'll just go on and do some other favorite passages here. Most of these are well known. Verses 9 through 16, and I'm not going to read all of that. How can a young man keep his way pure? By keeping it according to thy word. Thy word have I treasured or hidden, King James Version, in my heart, that I might not sin against thee. And there are a couple of songs.
What chapter is that in Psalm?
Psalm 119. There are a couple of songs that we have sung, not as a church necessarily, but there is one in the hymnal. How can the young secure their heart? And then the other one is what I learned as a child, thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against thee. There's a melody that goes with that as a children's song. Verse 18 is one. Open my eyes that I may see wonderful things from thy law. That's one of Chris Stewart's favorite verses. Verse 25. My soul cleaves to the dust. Revive me according to thy word. That's a continuing theme in the psalm, revival. It's a continuing theme in this psalm. 7 times at least he goes back to that particular theme. Verse 28, my soul weeps because of grief. Strengthen me according to thy word. Verses 57 and 58, the Lord is my portion. I've promised to keep thy words. I entreated thy favor with all my heart. Be gracious to me. How? According to thy word. Verses 89 through 91. Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven. Thy faithfulness continues throughout all generations. You did establish the earth, and it stands. They stand this day according to your ordinances. Verse 105, this is another children's song. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Psalm 160, or verse 160. The sum of thy word is truth, and every one of thy righteous ordinances is everlasting. Y'all have a favorite verse or stanza?
I am resolved to obey your statutes to the very end.
Okay. Well, do you know what verse number that is?
112,
120?
112.
112. And for those that didn't hear that, my translation says, I have inclined my heart to perform your statutes forever, even to the end. Yeah. Anyone else? Bill, you look thoughtful back there.
The one I think was 105.
Was 105? Okay. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Anyone else? What might you say is the main theme of this psalm, just based, if nothing else, on what I read?
Adoring God.
Adoring God. What goes along with that? God's Word. And what about God's Word in terms of our relationship to it? The importance of it. And in terms of an action, Linda?
You need to follow it.
Need to follow His Word, right. Keeping His Word. You know, part of the adoration of God is not only knowing His Word, but keeping His Word.
Verse 160 says, all your words are true, all your righteous laws are eternal.
God's law and our relationship to it, keep it, meditate on it, love it, cherish it. Have you ever thought about, I have a difficult time, I confess, confession time. I have a difficult time loving God's commands. I have a difficult time associating that word love as we know it in Christianity with God's commands. You're shaking your head yes. Do you agree with, are you another one of those that have trouble loving God's commands?
Not that way, but to love His grace in me.
Why would I might have trouble loving God's commands?
They're difficult.
They can be difficult.
We're sinful people.
Because you're human.
There you go. I think, Mike, that's it. I don't like to be told what to do. Is that right, Angela? You didn't have to agree so readily, you know.
I'm thinking of somebody else.
My whole life, I have just not particularly enjoyed being told what to do. Although my whole life I've worked for someone else who's been telling me what to do. And for 48 years I've been married. No, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. We do very well together, by the way, with that. It's like I'll just tell, she's not here. I'll just tell you, it's like a command, but she has learned to ask. You know, can we do this? Will it be okay to do this? And when she asks, I know what the answer always has to be. You know, and so we get along very well that way. Go ahead, Mary. Who's?
We need to change our thinking about God's commands,
We do.
because everything He tells us is to benefit us. The issue is it requires maturity to see that benefit in your life.
Right.
Sometimes you see the benefit or the not benefit and years later, but Psalm, the 119, verse 111, that this should be a goal for every child that we have, to get their frame of mind established on this. Your statutes are my heritage forever. Have you ever thought about that? Your statutes are my heritage. We think of the heritage as money or riches,
Right.
but his words are gold.
Right.
And he says, my heart is set on keeping your decrees to the very end. That should be the goal of every parent for their child, to train them in a way of thinking. We don't teach our children to think and reason, that they reason about God's word and realize value.
One of the things I see you, Marilee. Did you have your hand up for?
Well, that was the verse I was gonna read, because your statutes are my heritage forever. They are the joy of my heart. My heart is set on keeping your decrees to the very end. And what I was thinking of that is when we have such peace and comfort, when we know what our boundaries are.
Yeah.
And someone has set, God, our Creator, has set the boundaries. And we love and trust Him and know that He's done that for our good. And when we're surrounded by a world that is changing the boundaries, we can have peace and
Right.
comfort in going back to what God says. And I'm thinking of a story of a family member who sent to my 11-year-old son, when he was 11, postcards from Hawaii that weren't appropriate to send to a 11-year-old son. This was a family member, and I asked them please not to do that, and they called me a prude. And I thought, that's a compliment, because God is telling us to be prudent.
Right.
And I just, of course, we mess up and don't follow His statutes, but boy, they sure give us peace and comfort to know what our boundaries are from the loving God.
And I know all of that, what you said and what you said, but I haven't, hopefully I'm in the process of learning my lesson. I'm reminded of the verse, who was it that told Paul that he was kicking against the goads?
Jesus.
Was that someone told Paul, or was it Jesus? I don't remember. There's a place in there.
It was appeared to him.
Yeah. Jesus appeared to him and told him that. And I find myself at times kicking against that, and I shouldn't. I know I shouldn't. Melody, you had your hand up before Angela.
Well, it's along the same way. I just got back from taking care of my 9-month-old grandson who's crawling, and he wants to go places that are not safe for him to crawl.
Right.
And every time I would send him in a different direction, he was not a happy camper about it. And I'm thinking, I am so much like my 9-month-old grandson, that I have a path that I want to take, and God goes, no. And I'm not always a happy camper about him changing my direction.
And
Yet it's for my good that he.
And taking this and those two, and I'll get to you, Angela, and taking a cue from the lesson today, the sermon today, we don't have the full picture of our lives. We don't we don't have the whole thing. We don't have all the past, the present, and the future. We basically have today and what we recall about the past. But God does have the whole picture. And if he turns us in some other direction, it's not because he wants to be mean to us, it's because that's going to be the best direction for us.
My mother taught me that she said these rules and commandments are a way of God's protecting you. Always remembered that.
Okay. If you didn't hear that, Angela said her mother taught her that these rules and commands are God's ways of protecting us. Jerry?
I don't think I'm the only one hurt, but when you're about to get a spanking and this is gonna hurt me worse than it hurts. So it's kind of the same resistance, I think, and hopefully I've grown to accept, yes, sometimes it's gonna hurt.
And it will sometimes. It will sometimes. We may have to, God may have to, with some force, turn us in another direction. Mike?
Is this all under, I've heard the term agape love.
Okay.
Is that what we've really been talking about? Maybe I don't understand the.
Well, this was written in Hebrew, and that's a Greek word, so I'm not. What about that? Mike says, is this the kind of love we're talking about for his commands? Is this the agape type of love, or is there something else here? Is it one of the other ways that we think of love? What is agape love is unconditional. It's desiring the best for, we normally think of it as not desiring the best for someone else, even at our expense, if necessary. Or is there another kind of, is the word love here appropriate? I love your commands, Lord. If you love me, you will keep my commands.
The best you can.
He commands us to do things that's hard, like love your neighbor as you love yourself. Gail's my neighbor, but I'm just talking about
Is it hard to love her?
sometimes. I mean, you know, like, just saying, politicians, you know, that make you angry, you know. I need prayers for that a lot. You know, he commands us to love everybody. And sometimes some people are hard to love.
Mike, I honestly don't know. We generally talk about three kinds of love in the New Testament. There's the eros love, there's the brotherly love, and then there's the agape love. I don't know that this exactly fits with any of those as I think about it.
Yeah, I'm the same way, and I'm not sure of the definition. I think of it as kind of a love that's there, and you never deviate from it, but you don't think about it. And it's occasionally, you know, well, you know, the politician that you don't agree with very well, but you feel like you want to remain, you know, in a state of love to your fellow man.
Right. Let's ask the expert. Curtis? You have any comment on this idea of the types of love and what he's talking about here in the Old Testament regarding loving commands?
Yeah, I don't know offhand what the word is in Hebrew, but it's a deep-seated affection, I think, and so it is an affection, I think.
Okay.
Jay, I asked the other expert, Google.
Okay.
It is in the Septuagint, the agape word is used several times, verse 47, 48, 47.
Okay. So in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the word agape is used, which would be what you initially started out with, would be great affection for or desiring the best for. You know, I don't know how you desire the best for something inanimate, and so that probably wouldn't fit. But I'm sure there are many possible definitions of that agape word as well.
Does not, does not wishing them harm count as love?
Of course, well,
It seems to me that if God didn't love us, he wouldn't set protective barriers for us, just like we do for our children.
just like Melody was doing, watching their grandkid turning,
There are rules, but we know what is best for them. If they
setting boundaries, setting limits. It's not because I want to be mean, it's because, I know it's because, yeah, I have a bigger picture than my 1-year-old does, and so, yeah, I get it. We don't have anything similar to the Old Testament Torah. We don't have that. And that's part of, I think, what the psalmist was talking about here, was those kinds of commands. We don't have that. The New Testament tells us that we've been freed from the law by Jesus Christ, and I wonder when the bell's going to ring. We know that we can never earn favor with God just by keeping laws. We know that. All right. We normally don't think of our relationship with God as a matter of keeping the law, do we? We don't think of our relationship with God as a matter of keeping the law. What does this psalm have for us then? Why is it important to us? Why would Matt Reese want to memorize it, for heaven's sake? What's in it for us? And no, we don't have the Torah, but we've been talking about commands and love of God's law. Am I missing something here?
Well, in what they were referring to 111 and 112, but if you read 113 and 114 of that, the last part of 14 says, hope in his word.
Right.
We have hope in his word. It also talks about politicians there.
You know, politicians have been brought up here 4 or 5 times. On this side, over here. But not from this side over here.
Don't you think that this is just the way he would like us to live? And hopefully we can do it.
I think Norma, I think there are really good principles in 119 about keeping God's law. Everyone that has talked about love for God's law, keeping God's law is meant to be boundaries, it's meant to be protection for us, it's meant to be good for us, and so on. There are things loving one's neighbor was brought up a couple of times. For Pete's sake, if we can just even partially do some of that, and I'll bring up the politicians again. They are our neighbor. Whether we like it or not, they are our neighbor. And we, it's an attitude. It's the way we live life. It's the way we think. And I think there's a lot of good that can come out of 119 in terms of how we think, our actions will come if our thoughts and what's in our hearts is appropriate.
Jay, I used to invite politicians to a church that I used to be a member of, and it was quite interesting.
And it was quite, and it would be quite interesting. And we've, I don't know. It's tough sometimes. It's tough to love one's neighbor. Sometimes it's tough to love one's neighbor that lives next door to us. Let alone love some politician that is off somewhere else and doesn't know we exist. It's just,
You don't have to agree with someone to love them with the love of the Lord.
Right.
Well,
It's
when,
a different.
oh, I'm sorry, I thought you.
Right.
When he tells us to pray for those in positions of authority, is it wrong to say, God, would you put godly people in positions of authority?
Yeah.
That's what,
No, I don't think, Norma, it's wrong to do that, but there might be some thing about, God, would you please get this knothead out of here so we can, that's probably not quite the appropriate prayer,
if some of these evil ones would change, would you help them change?
Okay, the bell is rung once, and I'm not gonna wait for it to ring a second time. Besides, I'm almost at the end of my notes, so. Thank you. We'll get the first team again next week, and Curtis will finish up his classes.